Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Badab War. Last time, the Higher Lords of Terror had decreed that a force of Adeptus Astartes Space Marines be dispatched to the Maelstrom resource sector after Cygnus, one of the capital worlds of that area, was reduced to nothing more than a radioactive hunk of frozen rock spiraling through the galaxy. The coalition of Space Marine chapters dispatched would of course need some form of leadership. The Adeptus Astartes are famously independent-minded and would take ill to be ordered around by local sector command, especially within an autonomous zone. And so one of the four chapters would be given de facto leadership responsibilities over the other three. That honor fell to the Astral Claws chapter due to their long and distinguished military service in the name of the Imperium of Man. This was a decision that the Mantis Warriors, the Charnel Guard, and the Lamenters could all agree upon, for amongst them the Astral Claws were by far the most illustrious of the chapters. Thusly, with the command structure agreed upon, the four chapters, along with a permanent detachment of the Imperial Navy, would form the Wardens of the Maelstrom. And as a final honor, the Astral Claws chapter would also be granted an orbital battle station, a mighty void-born fortress, to become their new headquarters within the Badab sector, and thusly also the central headquarters of the Warders. But the Astral Claws had no time to get comfortable in their new space clubhouse. For even the Badab sector, once counted as one of the three primary pillars of the Maelstrom resource extraction grid, was becoming dangerously unstable and unruly. The domino effect heralded by the fall of Cygnus had already begun to exert its influence upon Badab. And so the very first thing the new Warders had to do was to carry out cleansing and securing operations within the Badab sector. Piratical activity had to be stamped out mercilessly, and any and all attempts of sedition or insurrection needed to be crushed. Immediately upon arriving within the Badab system, Rovik Blake, chapter master of the Astral Claws, set about making plans for this very objective. With 4,000 Space Marines and Imperial Navy elements all his to command, he made short work of the surrounding systems around Badab and began to stabilize the system. Resistance was in some areas fiercer than others, but faced with the full might of four Astartes chapters, insurrectionist, rebels, and pirate elements were all destroyed in short order. But Rovik was a veteran chapter master, and quickly recognized that the instability and insurrections were symptoms of a much graver and greater disease. These planets were not inherently corrupt or disloyal. They had simply fallen under the influence of external forces, raiders from within the Maelstrom, and on occasion even vile Xenos influence. It was therefore the duty of the God Emperor Space Marines to reintroduce peace and stability to the sector, and to do that, Rovik would seek to re-establish the shield that had previously been made up of Sagan, Badab, and Cygnus. And the very first step in this grander goal would of course be to make the Badab system itself safe. In pursuit of this goal, Rovik's first general decree was the establishment of the Warders Fleet. This would be made up of the Imperial Navy elements attached to the Warders at their inception, and also the fleet-based Astartes chapters, the Lamenters, and the Charnel Guard. Both were in possession of battle barges and strike cruisers, mighty vessels of war more than a match for anything the local rebels or pirate forces could ever hope to possess. And so, the newly reorganized Warders fleet began to scatter throughout the Badab sector. The Imperial Navy elements were primarily charged with escort and picket duties, maintaining the security of trade lanes between planets. Meanwhile, the Charnel Guard and the Lamenters would strike out into the void surrounding the Badab sector, hunting down any and all remnants of pirates, Xenos raiders, or insurrectionists that may otherwise have been able to return or spread havoc elsewhere. Simultaneously, the Mantis Warriors were granted a very similar mission, but on the planets themselves. Whilst the Executioners and the Lamenters were hunting down the last few dregs of enemies in the void, the Mantis Warriors would root them out where they had gone to ground on terra firma. And finally, the Astral Claws assisted with all of these missions wherever needed, along with providing command and control and flagship duty to the Imperial Navy elements, whilst also ensuring that the primary Badab system, along with the chapter's brand new Void-born Fortress Monastery, were made secure and able to resist any last-ditch desperate attempts to strike at the Imperial forces in a beheading maneuver. It was considered unlikely for the enemy to possess the kind of military force required for such an action, but Rovik was a careful and methodical commander who saw no reason to jeopardize what appeared to be a certain victory in the Badab system with a last-second lapse in diligence. This tentative approach turned out to be a successful strategy, and before long, the Imperium could once again claim suzerainship over the Badab sector. The first and most vitally important of steps had been achieved. The Warders had moved into the Maelstrom extraction zone and re-established order, preventing the second domino's fall. But of course, all of that was nothing more than a defensive action. All of that was nothing more than salvaging the shattered pieces of the shield that had once protected the resource zone, and the proper imperial territory of Carthago beyond it. To bring any measure of true security to the resource extraction grid, a change of strategy was needed. It would never be enough to simply just defend what the Imperium already had. Rovik had 4,000 Space Marines at his command. That was a force equal to the task of ruining worlds and destroying virtually any enemy. But as formidable a manifestation of Imperial might this was, those 4,000 Space Marines had been tasked with defending an area of space that it would easily take 6 months of good warp travel to cross. There was simply no way 4,000 warriors, no matter how individually potent or superior each one of them was to the enemy, to effectively patrol such an extensive area of space. Even at its most stable, with all 3 pillar worlds intact, the shield of Cygnus, Sagan, and Badab, with their massively militarized system, Imperial Navy resources, guard regiments, and planetary defense troops, all they had managed to do was maintain a slow, crumbling degradation of Imperial strength in the zone. And now, Rovik was asked to not only replicate that, but to do better, with 1,000th of the manpower. But then again, doing the impossible is merely one part of the Space Marine's job description. With Badab secured, and the Astral Claw's new Void-born Fortress Monastery fully renovated, Rovik called for a meeting of the Warders chapters. The Lamenters, the Charnel Guard, and the Mantis Warriors would all meet up with the Astral Claws to discuss the next step of their campaign to secure the resource extraction grid. And Rovik put forth a plan that was bold and ambitious, but also characteristically careful and methodical. It would not be the work of a weekend to prepare for the next great step in their reconquest campaign. Indeed, it would take 53 years before the offensive already labelled the Scourge campaign could be launched. And of course, the chapters did not sit idly by during those 5 decades. Even though the Badab sector had been secured, there was still an awful lot of fires raging across the Maelstrom-adjacent resource extraction grid, all of which would have to be put out before the Scourge campaign could be launched. A warrior who swings the weapon without first securing his footing, after all, would only open himself up for a counterattack. As a part of securing this footing, the chapters would spread themselves across the sector, protecting Imperial worlds and carrying out an aggressive campaign of attacks upon targets of opportunity, ensuring that the pirates would have to worry about their own bases, their own supply lines and their own ships, rather than figuring out which target to strike next. This gave many of the planets a crucial period of breathing room, enough for them to begin rebuilding their own PDF contingents and to receive further Imperial Guard reinforcements from across the Imperium. Slowly but surely, the Imperial power of the Badab sector grew considerably, and incrementally, the Mantis warriors, the Lamenters, the Charnel Guard, and the Astral Claws were needed less and less for mundane patrol duty and preservative projects. With their rear as safe as it was ever likely to get, the Warders chapters could, at long last, begin the Scourge campaign. This was an action that had been long planned and prepared. Whenever there had been any leeway in their operational deployment, Rovik had dispatched individual ships and 10th Company scouts into the outer edges of the Maelstrom zone, where the greatest concentration of enemy pirates, raiders, and vile Xenos breeds were expected to be holed up. And after 50 years of scouting and intelligence reports along with minor running skirmishes, that theory had been more than proven. In fact, more than a dozen enemy strongholds had been positively identified and designated as targets for the Scourge campaign, with further to be added to the list as the campaign gained steam, prisoners were taken, and yet further intelligence gathered. The objective of the Scourge campaign was as simple as it was ambitious: to root out and destroy the enemy's bases of operation, prevent all further raids into the resource extraction grid, and make the area safe for Imperial space travel by, quite simply, wiping out anything and everything that might otherwise threaten it. For all his caution, for all his prudence and planning, you certainly cannot accuse Chapter Master Rovik Blake of lacking in ambition. It was a bold plan, and it may very well have been a foolhardy one as well. The Warders chapter were operating with an absolute minimum of intelligence as to the nature and number of the opposition that they would encounter, but they knew for a fact that at the very least one warband of renegade space marines were still operational within the outer edges of the Maelstrom. It was the very same renegade warband, the Reborn, that had contributed so crucially to the death of Cygnus, now many decades ago. And Chaos Space Marines were but one of the many lethal hazards prowling the outer edges of the Maelstrom warp storm. There were entire mini-orc empires found within that area of space. There were Eldar raiders, piratical elements, chaos worshippers, and Xenos entities most foul. If the Warders became bogged down against one particularly resilient foe, they might quickly find themselves beset on all sides by a variety of enemies. But Rovik wagered that the various forces within the outer edges of the Maelstrom were not on friendly terms either, and would be unable to mount any sort of a concerted effort to trap or stymie the advance of the Warders. And with 4 full chapters at his beck and call, he reckoned he could quite swiftly overcome any local resistance and carry on before they could draw upon whatever allies they might have hiding in that most turbulent area of space. And Rovik appeared to be right. In a lightning campaign, in relative void terms, bear you in mind, that would last for a full 11 years, the Warders chapters, with the Astral Claws and Rovik at their head, assaulted over a dozen worlds, and then discovered a dozen more. For every enemy stronghold they secured, 2 more would pop up, and the Warders chapters would quickly move on to annihilate them as well. The most telling victory came when the Mantis Warriors finally managed to corner the reborn warband on a world known as Taskar's Wound. The Mantis Warriors had a score to settle after Cygnus, where they had lost many battle brothers trying to prevent and halt the massive civil war that had eventually resulted in the planet being reduced to nothing more than a spinning corpse in space. After locating the Reborn's bolt hole, the Mantis Warriors had besieged the planet and placed it under a continuous blockade by their warships, before, over the course of many weeks, winkling them out of their hidey holes, their armored bunkers, and their places of refuge. The Chaos Space Marines, despite their pitted and worn armor and archaic weaponry, fought with considerable zeal and determination, knowing full well that their last hours in this universe had come. But the Mantis Warriors were not about to relinquish their foe now. It had taken many years of searching, of hunting, and merciless tracking through the Maelstrom Void to finally bring these most accursed traitors to battle. No Space Marine force ever goes easily, even the most corrupted of them, but the green-clad sons of the Khan proved themselves equal to the task they had set before them, and one by one, the Reborn were undone. Their armor, already pitted, rusted, and corrupted, broken open by blades and bolt of fire, until the Mantis Warriors could heap the corpses of their foe into great bonfires and burn them all. The death of Cygnus had been most thoroughly avenged, and the Reborn, a threat that had been plaguing the Imperium of Man for over 800 years, was, by all accounts, completely destroyed. Ever since the action at Taskar's Wound, no Chaos Space Marine warband bearing their heraldry or their colors have ever been sighted again, suggesting that the Mantis Warriors here put an end to one of the greatest threats against the Imperium, a force of the most hated traitor Astartes. An act of considerable valor and worthy of being the crowning jewel in the Scourge campaign, but, unfortunately, it would appear that Rovik was about to become a victim of his own success. He had forged deep into the Maelstrom Zone, something that no Imperial troops had done for over 1,000 years, and in so doing, the Warders had located and destroyed dozens of strongpoints. They had rooted the enemies of man out from planets. They had broken their star bases, smashed open their fortresses, crippled their fleets, and crushed their orbital rings. Over 11 standard years, the Astral Claws, Mantis Warriors, Lamenters, and Charnel Guard had inflicted more damage upon the foes of the most glorious God Emperor in the Maelstrom Zone than any other Imperial force had for a millennia or more. One might even say that Rovik had achieved all his objectives. He had made the Maelstrom Zone safe for Imperial commerce again, and the richness of the resource extraction grid was once more flowing into the Imperium. And the higher lords of Terra apparently agreed. And as we all know, no good deed ever goes unpunished. On direct orders from the Adeptus Terra, the Charnel Guard were commanded to sever their connection with the Warders and leave the Maelstrom Zone immediately, and lend their strength instead to the Thanos Crusade, currently moving into the Veiled region. And so, with the stroke of a pen, a fourth of the Space Marine troops under Rovik's command simply just disappeared. If you've ever wondered why the military takes such a dim view of bureaucrats, well, that might give you a general idea. With 25% of his total strength ripped from his grasps by a piece of paper, Rovik had no choice but to cancel the Scourge campaign and withdraw out from the outer edges of the Maelstrom and back into the resource extraction grid, where they were no doubt lauded as conquering heroes. The people of the grid had been following the events of the Scourge campaign with breathless anticipation and excitement. Every victory lauded, every minor setback or defeat booed with passion across the grid and the populace. Many of these people have had their lives directly saved by the Warders. Many of them were only allowed to live in this period of relative peace due to the actions of the Astartes. Hell, the only reason why most of the planets still existed and weren't burnt husks raided to annihilation by piratical factions was precisely, again, the existence of the Warders of the Maelstrom. They absolutely were heroes, and as they return, I am sure many amongst them thought themselves quite worthy of that title. Over the course of 11 years of warfare, they had put hundreds of thousands of Xenos, of traitors, of heretics, and raiders to the sword. They had destroyed countless enemy strongholds. In any traditional conflict, the opposition's capability to wage war would have been put so thoroughly out of commission as to never threaten the Imperium again. But even as the conquering heroes returned, some amongst their upper leadership feared that this was not a conventional war, and this was not a traditional enemy. When Rovik had plunged his 4 chapters into the outer edges of the Maelstrom, he had presumed, correctly so, that the various forces within would not be able to coordinate a response to his invasion. The heretics would not help the Xenos would not help the traitors, and the traitors would not help the Eldar raiders. This had of course all benefited the Warders' chapters immeasurably. They were free to bounce from target to target without worrying about a coalition being formed against them. They could even use various factions as flank guards to protect their own advances, knowing full well that they would only ever have to fight one faction at a time. But this convenience was only truly an advantage whilst the Warders' chapters were on the offensive. Whilst attacking, they could continuously locate, designate, and destroy new targets, new points of interest, new coalescing gatherings of hostiles. This allowed the Warders to destroy them one by one. And there was no shortage of opposition. The Warders' chapters were no doubt amazed at the sheer quantity of enemies that they were able to locate. The outer edges of the Maelstrom Zone had always been recognized to be a haunt of the less desirable elements of the galaxy, but the sheer abundance of targets presented to the invader was beyond any and all expectation. It was literally infested with those hostile to the Imperium and its established order. Given another decade or so, maybe the Warders could have stamped out every last bit of resistance that remained, but they didn't have another decade. And so, for every organization crushed beneath the power-armored boots of the Astartes, 2 more would spring into being. and with the complete absence of a central command or authority system, there was no head of the serpent, no decapitating blow, no spinal shot that could put down the adversary once and for all. Just a million billion tiny little independent cells that all needed prosecuting one by one. And thusly, whilst the rest of the Imperium was celebrating the heroics of the Wardens chapters and the great blow they had landed against the villainous foe, those in command of the chapters, the masters of the Mantis Warriors, Lamenters, and Astral Claws, knew that whilst they had savaged the foe, they had not killed it. And all they could hope now was that those who still remained in the edges of the Maelstrom zone would have been so thoroughly mauled as to simply bleed out and expire on their own. But the galaxy is rarely quite such a cooperative place, and Chapter Master Rovik was painfully aware of that simple fact. And yet, for nearly 20 years thereafter, the universe conspired to prove Rovik wrong. For 2 decades, the extraction grid, the area under the Warder's protection, experienced a near unrivaled period of peace and prosperity. Navigating the resource extraction grid was as adventurous as always, of course, with warp squalls and sudden drastic changes in direction, but as far as piratical activity went, raiding had fallen to an all-time low. Xenos activity had almost ceased entirely, and even the threat of chaotic intervention this close to a warp storm became a rather minor concern. There was still the occasional spot of looting here and there, the odd marauder that made it through the safety net surrounding the zone, and occasionally a ship would go missing under suspicious circumstances. But by and large, the populace of the autonomous zone had rarely, if ever, had it quite this good. And then, the Unhallowed Heart arrived. After their premature withdrawal from the Scourge campaign, the Warders chapters had established countless listening posts and spy stations along the outer edges of the Maelstrom. These had operated well for the last 20 years, warning of corsairs, marauders, and pirates of all stripes attempting to make it out or in to the Maelstrom, allowing the Warders to either intercept them on their way to a target or trying to return to safety. However, in 681 Millennia 41, these stations started to go silent. Now, the occasional station being knocked offline was hardly uncommon. There were a myriad different reasons for why one might stop responding. There were a myriad different reasons for why 2 or 3 or 4 might stop responding. But dozens of them were going offline, and no messages were being sent, no cries for help, no information, no warning about an incoming fleet, no nothing. The stations would be transmitting as usual with no sign of danger or anything amiss one day, and the next day, silence. The only way to determine the direction of whatever entity was knocking out the stations was to look at the ones getting destroyed and then correlate a rough course for the object. Once that was established, rapid reaction forces stationed along the edges of the Maelstrom moved in to find out exactly what they were dealing with. Standard procedure would see frigates and light destroyers move out ahead of a mainstay fleet to locate and engage the enemy in running skirmishes if possible, or if not, then retreat back and inform the rest of the fleet as to the location and strength of the opposition. But once again, the lead elements simply disappeared. No cries of panic, no shouted pleas for help, just more silence. The first positive identification and engagement with the enemy came, finally, when an Astral Claw strike cruiser leading a large Imperial Navy detachment reported that they saw the stars going out, a vast blackness in the void blocking out the light. The thing that had slipped out of the maelstrom was a monster of the void, a colossal behemoth of the warp. A space hulk, so vast, so gargantuan as to be detectable first and foremost by long-range augers from the huge patch of blackness in which its sheer bulk was blocking out the light of the stars. Now, of course, a space hulk can vary considerably in size, in shape, and most importantly, in the threat it poses to civilized worlds nearby. You may find another record talking more about space hulks somewhere else on this channel, released quite recently. But this thing, a space hulk hitherto unknown in Imperial archives and thusly designated as the Unhallowed Heart, was a true horror of a space hulk. Now, they may be infested with all manners of things, gene stealers, orcs, xenos of all breeds and races, and these can certainly pose considerable danger to nearby systems, but the Unhallowed Heart was host to something far more horrific than any such mundane threat. The precise nature of the unholy abomination that lay at the center of the Unhallowed Heart will never be known, and that is probably a good thing. Because what we do know is that the very presence of the Unhallowed Heart would drive the minds of men insane. The fate of the listening stations and the scout ships were that once they entered within the psychic effect radius of the Hulk, the crews were driven instantaneously and irreversibly mad. Many of them would die almost outright. The officers, the serfs, the crew members, even the servitors would fall over with blood fountaining from their eyes as undescribable terrors of the warp forced their way into their fragile minds and broke them like so much glass. Those who remained conscious for a short period would be sent spiraling into brutalistic, murderous rampages, ripping and tearing anyone else still alive apart with their teeth and fingernails. And to the horrors of the Warders' command structure, this was not unique to the crews of the Imperial Navy vessels. Even the Astral Claw strike cruiser fell prey to this warping effect. Even the God Emperor's finest Adeptus Astartes could not approach the Unhallowed Heart and live. But this was not a danger that could be ignored. The Space Hulk had already killed tens of thousands with its mere presence alone, and that was in the sparsely near empty reaches of the Maelstrom Zone's edges. It was heading deeper into the resource extraction grid. If the Unhallowed Heart was allowed to reach the more densely populated centers, it would claim the lives of millions at first and then billions soon thereafter. With no other option, the Warders threw everything they had at it. The Imperial Navy element dispatched every ship they could, but they were limited to long-range speculative torpedo volleys, and even that, with the vessels darting in to maximum range, firing, and immediately twisting to full burn away from the Hulk, would lose hundreds of crew members each and every time. Naval armsmen would constantly patrol the halls of the vessels, clutching combat shotguns in nervous hands, ready to be brought up and unleashed upon anyone found outside of their assigned positions. No chances could be taken when engaged with such a nefarious foe. A crewman seemingly unhurt could be moments away from becoming the new host of a demonic entity, and others were driven mad by bloodlust and had to be put down even as they charged screaming towards the groups of heavily armed guards. And occasionally, even the armsmen themselves, despite their extensive training and resisting the lure of the warp, would suddenly turn upon their allies and unload their guns at point-blank range, with predictable and devastating results. The efforts of the Imperial Navy were costly and yet ineffective. A Space Hulk is a leviathan of the warp. Dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of vessels, all twisted and merged together in a contorted mockery of their previous form, and then spat out into the real world again as a mountain of tortured metal. Against this void-born landmass, the Imperial Navy's torpedoes, those few who actually struck it, despite being launched at maximum range, and all of the interference virtually radiating from the Hulk, little, if any, real damage was done. Plasma and melter warheads could vaporize hundreds of meters of hull and achieve nothing more than scorching the surface of this thing. Nothing more than the mild irritant of a tiny bug to a woolen mammoth. The Space Marine vessels fared somewhat better. Due to their superior constitution and training, they were able to get in closer, and also fire lance batteries and bombardment cannons in addition to their own torpedoes launched at ranges in which misses were unlikely. But even these potent vessels, firing everything they had, could do little more than chip away at the immensity of their target. And every minute spent within the baleful presence of the Unhallowed Heart saw the casualties rise dramatically amongst the human servants of the Space Marines, the serfs, the servitors, and the regular crew members that manned the guns and reloaded the torpedoes. And as demonstrated by the tragic fate of the Astral Claw's strike cruiser, even the heroic Adeptus Astartes could only withstand the influence of the Hulk for so long before even they began to succumb. As best they could, the Warders and the Imperial Navy would dart in, do whatever damage they could, and try to get out before suffering irreversible losses. Over the course of a long period of slowly chiseling away at the Unhallowed Heart, hunting it down and striking at it wherever it would appear, as it would periodically slip in and out of the warp, eventually the Unhallowed Heart arrived at a major populated planet, the colony world of Ashuna, and all the Warders' worst fears were realized, as the planet was plunged almost immediately into a maelstrom of chaos and hatred. Madness swept the planet from pole to pole, tens of thousands committing suicide, unable to bear the horrors in the night no longer. Even more succumbed to mass hysteria. Thousands upon thousands were trampled to death or threw themselves off buildings. Others succumbed to murderous rampages and began stalking the streets in ever-growing packs of armed civilians, beating to death anyone they came across. And as if feeding off the misery it was causing, the Unhallowed Heart's aura grew even more powerful, until eventually only the Lamenter's chapter could approach it. For some unknowable reason, the Space Marines of the Lamenters seemed able to withstand its influence far better than any of the other Warders' chapters. As to whether or not this was due to some unique ability inherent within their gene seed as a member of the cursed founding chapters, or whether or not it was simply due to the Lamenters having seen more misery and suffering in their history than any other chapter of the Space Marines, is unclear. But personally, at least, I favor the interpretation that even the warp could not dredge up enough misery, enough misfortune, enough horror, enough terror to outmatch that which had dogged the Lamenter's steps since the earliest days of their founding. For the Lamenters truly do deserve the reputation as the unluckiest chapter in Space Marine history. But as death continued to spread across the surface of Ashuna, even the Lamenters, slowly at first, but ever more rapidly, began to fall prey to the influence of the Unhallowed Heart. In desperation, almost the entirety of the Lamenter's chapters threw everything they could imagine at the Space Hulk. Point-blank barrages from bombardment cannon, lancers overcharged to the point of annihilation and meltdown, torpedo salvos fired almost directly into the Hulk, even whilst boarding parties of Lamenter's Terminators and Battle Brothers hammered into the Space Hulk via boarding torpedoes and Cestus assault rams, scouring it for anything and everything that could be sabotaged. Plasma reactors and ancient weapon caches, everything was found, rigged, and detonated in a desperate attempt to break the abomination up. Down on the surface of Ashuna, the death toll kept spiraling ever upwards, whilst in orbit a frantic struggle ensued. Many hours passed as the Lamenter's strike cruisers and battle barges hammered away at the Unhallowed Heart at point-blank range. Even as the crew aboard the Lamenter's vessels died in ever-increasing agony and torment, they tore rents out of the Space Hulk, ripped ravines out of its metal flesh, and the Lamenters boarding it found access to yet further plasma generators and ammunition depots, sending entire segments of the Hulk spinning off into the void on plumes of atomic fire. As the night on the planet dragged on and on, the Unhallowed Heart began to move away from the planet. Like a wounded beast, it was being forced back, but the Lamenters would not relent. They would not let it go. Doggedly, they continued their assault until the obscene thing was trying once more to slip into the warp, and yet even then, risking the backlash from its warp reactors, tearing a hole in reality, enough to wipe out the entire Lamenter's fleet, they did not relent until finally the gruesome thing broke apart beneath their weapons. Aboard the command bridge of the Lamenter's flagship battle barge, the Mater Lacrimarum, no one had the strength left to raise a victory cry. The Lamenters had suffered the loss of over 300 battle brothers, along with 4 strike cruisers and severe casualties on all their remaining vessels. And back on the planet of Ashuna, just as the first few rays of dawn began to creep across the night side of the world, the one that had been exposed to the worst of the Unhallowed Heart's influence, the dead could be counted. The massacre had been such that it would take local planetary officials weeks and months to come up with a final estimate. Many of the victims had quite literally been torn limb from limb. Entire settlements had seemingly drowned in their own blood as their inner organs burst apart. In the end, it was estimated that a full quarter, 1/4 of the entire planet's populace had died on that one long night. The Unhallowed Heart had arrived in orbit above a single populated world and reaped the lives of millions and possibly billions. The Wardens had done everything in their power to stop it, and had they not, the death toll would have been much, much greater. And first amongst these sacrifices, of course, stood the Lamenters. Once more. A dubious honor, perhaps, but to their fellow Warders chapters, the Lamenters' sacrifice was considered an act of true heroism and unfathomable bravery. And their casualties were worthy martyrs, heroes one and all. The Lamenters received a great deal of plaudits, both, of course, from their battle brothers and their fellow Warders chapters, and undoubtedly, as well, from the populace of the Maelstrom Zone. Without their intervention, things could have been so very much worse, but not everyone agreed. Whenever a threat like the Unhallowed Heart appears within the borders of the Imperium, it is far from uncommon for other forces to take an interest. In this case, it was the Ordo Malus, the arm of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition that concerns itself primarily with demons and other creatures of the unnatural and the warp. They dispatched several representatives and adepts to the resource extraction zone to investigate this incursion. In all due technicality, the authority of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition is quite literally infinite. There is no part of his Imperium that they cannot command, that they cannot control, that they cannot intervene in directly. And so the Warders had no grounds with which to intervene. The Ordo Malus adepts continued their investigation and were at one point hosted by the Lamenter's chapters themselves to interview those who had taken part in the fighting and also review their logs as to their combat with the Unhallowed Heart. It came, however, as a bit of a shock to everyone within the Maelstrom sector when the Ordo Malus delegation outright condemned the actions of the Warders' chapters and criticized the Lamenters in particular for not having acted sooner and more decisively to destroy this threat. To add yet further insult to injury, the Ordo Malus representatives went so far as to imply that the mass deaths that occurred on Ashuna was at least in part the Lamenter's chapter's fault for not having driven off and destroyed the Unhallowed Heart quicker. Reminding you once more that the entirety of the Warders' chapter's navy, along with Imperial navy elements, had not managed to even wound the thing until the Lamenters drove it away from Ashuna. A less charitable interpretation of the Ordo Malus position may indeed be that they were lambasting the Lamenters for not having completed the impossible task set before them in a more timely manner, as judged by those who had never seen the Unhallowed Heart on anything but a picked recording. This was all too much for the Lamenters. They had sacrificed 300 of their brothers and 4 of their warships in the destruction of the Unhallowed Heart. And Malachim Foros, the chapter master of the Lamenters, personally ordered the Ordo Malus delegation to be escorted as briskly and quickly as possible off the Mater Lacriarum and instructed in no uncertain terms to fuck off. A slight paraphrase, perhaps, but undoubtedly it captures the spirit of the intent. Unfortunately, as justifiable as we may view such an act, the Ordo Malus had a very different interpretation of the actions taken by the Lamenters and the Warders before and after the Unhallowed Heart. And there is no entity in the whole wide galaxy, not even amongst the dark-hearted kin of the Eldar, that can nurse a grudge quite like an Inquisitor can. A dark shadow was about to begin creeping in over the Maelstrom zone. But, at least for the time being, the Warders' chapters and the Lamenters could celebrate their recent achievements, no matter what the perception of certain individuals may be. And with that, I will wrap up the second episode of the War for Badab. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.